What's good people? All my Patreons around the world, y'all get the first right of refusal, meaning that y'all just get to see it first. That's all. Um, there are a lot of different elements that took place around the globe that we don't know about. History has been changed, buried deep under the ground, so that it'll never be discovered and found by us as they push new history on us and tell us what history is, which has always been known as a lie. Now, let's talk about the father of the civil rights movement, Prince Hall. Now, people are so confused because of time that they have no idea of what they're talking about, but they do. They don't want to honor this man for what he truly was. They want to honor him for what they want him to be. Prince Hall was not a white man. They illustrate him as a man who is Caucasian. They paint him as a man who is Caucasian. And that is not his description whatsoever. He does not look like that photo. Now, why would they try to do that? They also believed, because they didn't even know his history, right? They just knew that he was born in the Barbados, and they said, oh, he worked most of his childhood on sugar plantations and, lived a slave life, and he was brought to Boston as a slave to a man named William Hall, where he was into leather tanning trades and stuff like that. But he came here as a slave. And he married Sarah Ritchie, who was a slave. They tell you this about this man, right? They said he joined a congressional church, rather, and once he did that, he also in the 70s, 1770s, he petitioned the court and all of these different things. He fought in a war and the Continental Army. They tell you all of these things. And I'm here to tell you, they have all of this wrong. Now, I'm here to tell you right now, Prince Hall was never a slave. I repeat, Prince Hall was never a slave. He was never purchased by somebody named William Hall. They try to say they didn't know his history because they try to bury his history to make changes to it. Just like they made changes to his image. Prince Hall, they said, oh, his life story is a history of debate. It's no debate. It's what it is. He was born in the Barbados. They got that right. But he was born 1748 in Bridgetown. People try to say, oh no, he was born in 1735, 1738. He was born September 12th, 1748 in Bridgetown, Barbados, to Thomas Prince Hall, his father, an Englishman and a free colored woman of French descent. The Hall family was very respected family members and was well known for their excellent character. At the age of 12, Prince Hall became a leather apprentice under his father, where he made advancements in trade. So where's this William Hall who taught this man how to be a shoemaker and learning leather tanning while he was a slave? These are the lies they tell you because it fits the narrative. If you hear that, they don't want to hear somebody was their own man from the beginning in the 1700s. Prince Hall wanted to come to America because in a country he don't know what's going on barbarically over here. He wants to come here because they keep selling it as the place of opportunity to grow. His parents didn't want him to come here. In February of 1765, he got on a vessel port bound for America. In March, he came to Boston, a 17-year-old, not a slave. He lived in Medford and worked for years, saving his money while he was married to Sarah Ritchie, a slave who died shortly after their marriage. He was never a slave. He had paperwork to prove that he wasn't. Some tried to raid and make him a slave, kidnap him, and put him into a slave trade. It did not work. He spoke intelligently. They were not used to this. A black speaking like this is dangerous. Many threats was made on his life in Boston because of it. My bad. I had to step out for a minute. So he began teaching other blacks and other slaves and found out ways that they could be freed from their bondage. Because this is not the America he knew about. Now, he did have a son with another woman. How accurate that is, we don't know, because some people say that never happened. Because Delilah, who was a servant at another person's household, was a woman that he had a child with, some people said, after the fact of once his wife died. He ended up having Primus Hall, his son, with Delilah. Now, I don't know about that. I do know he did get married to Sarah Ritchie. And he got a certificate of manumission for her. He was able to present that to her after the Boston Massacre that took place in it was like 1770 or something like that at the time. But he was able to get papers to free his wife of bondage. Now, he also married another girl in Massachusetts. Her name was Flora Gibbs, and that's who became his wife for the rest of his life. Now, looking at the black condition, though, he was able to realize the problem was education. They were keeping us from it. And he said, okay, let's find a way to make this happen. Let's find a way to educate Americans and free them, the brothers. He was from the Barbados, came here, saw what was happening, got involved. People in Massachusetts, in Boston, we're in 2021 and we know what Boston is now. This is the 1700s. Do you know what he was doing there? Holding his own. People were scared to touch him. Why? Because he had real estate. And he's like, we could just take the land. No, you couldn't. He joined the Continental Army. He was so wise because he was from the Barbados. He has been on the waters. He's seen everything outside of the country. He was very astute, a lawman, a man of the law. And he fought, and one of the very few men they had fight on Bunker Hill. Then he started to teach ministry when he came back at the Methodist Church. And he always talking about abolishing slavery. He used the church to build up slavery as a way of holding people down. When the British had came by and was there in Boston, before they left, they spoke to, sorry about that, they spoke to Prince Hall. And when they spoke to him, they started to talk about Masons and what they were about and how to be free from bondage and all these, and having a union and putting stuff together, and everybody in the lodge come together and tell them about class and skills, and you can unite people regardless of all of these different things. So when the British was sitting there and they were talking, he ended up becoming the first person to create his own lodge of Freemasons. First of its kind. The African Masonic Lodge. So now he went to political advancements, and he was going to liberate slaves in the process of doing that. Belinda Royale's petition, when they were addressing the General Court back in 1783, he went and drafted a petition for a process of emancipation for slaves. Then in 1787, he petitioned for a return to Africa movement, as well as several others. Because what people didn't know is a lot of us at that time want to go back to Africa. In the 1700s, they wanted to go back to Africa. They were like, screw this place, send me back to Africa. He had several other movements. So in the lodge, they would all have these meetings. The first African Mason Lodge was by him. So before there was a civil rights movement, he was already waging it. Do you know what kind of discrimination he had to go up against? Prince Hall was not able to join the white Mason Lodge in America, even though the Masons all preached brotherhood. The other Masons didn't like it. They wanted to insist that they keep blacks out of their lodges. And that's when Prince Hall turned to the British Masons, who was stationed in Boston. That's how that came to be. A war hero who fought for this country. In the war, he was good enough to shed blood and die for this country, right? But they weren't good enough to be in your lodge. But they could shoot a gun for you. Again, this is the 1700s. We in now what year? 2021. Ain't that about the same? Ain't we about in that same condition? Come on now, this is real black history. Bet you they didn't teach you about him in your school. I bet you they didn't tell you anything about this man's ability to speak different languages. Back then, slaves could speak French. Most of them spoke French. They spoke like 7 different African dialects. Almost all the slaves did until they were eliminated from it completely. Because slaves could communicate to each other. And most of the slave owners did not speak their dialect. So they would teach them English, but not to be able to read. We learned the English language without being able to see words and know what they mean. Just from the words being spoken and yelled at, we picked up the dialect and learned the language. Subject-oriented learners, not object-oriented. So we were able to learn their language, teach it to others without knowing how to read the language. It wasn't being taught to us. So back in 1775, before the British Army left though, Prince Hall, and he had about 14 other blacks that was in his crew, that was in the African Mason Lodge. They became members of the British Army Lodge, number 441. Peter Best, Duff Buffum, John Canton, Peter Freeman, Fortin Howard, Cyrus Johnbus, Prince Peyton, Prince Reese, Thomas Sanderson, Burston Slinger, Cato Spiang, Boston Smith, Benjamin Timber, and Richard Tilley. Now, these people here were held to a certain standard of prejudiceness that they had to fight here in this country as the British went back to America. But they knew the laws of this land. They knew the laws of this country. And not all white people were racist. Racism is taught from household to household. It is a condition. It is a systematic hate monger that is pushed. And it is taught, not bred, taught. It's enforced. Society will teach you, and they pass it on from generation to generation, making them fear or feel like they are superior to. And they believe it. The same BS that you want in life is the same BS everybody else is going through in life. But if people are being mistreated, why would anyone have any qualms about them being outraged about being mistreated? I have no idea. To me, that makes no sense. So anyway, Prince Hall wanted to petition the Grand Lodge of England for permission to establish a lodge of himself, and he was granted a charter called the Grand Lodge of England for the African Lodge, which was number 459. Then that's when the African Lodge became official, and they got the Golden Fleece, and they were in Boston, Massachusetts. Now, in 1827, the African Lodge declared itself independent and was renamed the African Grand Lodge Number 1 in 1827. Right? Became number 1. So we're going to learn some real black history today. Make sure y'all hit that Cash App, Carcino, the name on the Cash App, Karceno, as you are in school today. Oh, man. A lot of people don't realize all the struggles that he went through because of it. They burned down one of his homes that he lived in, and they put a cross out in front of his yard. Ku Klux Klan members were out there rioting and picketing and doing all of these things in his home that he had lived in. So now his new home was more closely to town. So that kind of activity don't happen there because there's too many eyes, too many people witnessing it. And like I told you, not everybody who's white is racist. There were a lot of people who fought for liberations who were white, who didn't think it was fair what was happening to us. They didn't want us here, but they also didn't want us to be beaten and whipped and all of these different inflictions. They didn't want to see it. Most of them lost their lives trying to help slaves. Now, they would have their local papers that would inform them of activities that were happening during slavery. And in these certificates, and they would detail things that were happening, they would lie and tell them that this man is vicious, he's an animal, he's a savage, he's a beast, and he comes over, the thick-lipped beast would come in and attack people, and he hurt people in the town, and now he's on the loose. But all he did was find a way to get free, and he's trying to run away from these people. So now in the newspaper, they're reading that these guys are so savage. Oh my God. What are we going to do? We're not safe. So it backfired. So instead of creating people to just dislike them, they created people that want them away. So now they don't want the slavery process at all. Now they like, why are you bringing these dangerous people around us? We're not safe. So now you've threatened your business of building this nation off of our backs. So the educational process was slacking, and that most of the women were very sympathetic to what was happening to the African American male, and they wanted to teach them, and they would sneak and teach some of the black women and some of the black males, how to read. They were teaching class. So while they would teach their daughter, they're also teaching them also. They would sneak and do it. And they had to conceal the fact that they learned how to read. So the first petitional act, by being in a hall, it gave him being a Freemason, brother. This guy not only established the first black institution in the United States, but established a firm foundation with other blacks in his country that he could build. He used Freemasonry as a device to help his brothers and sisters when they struggle for equality, because that's one thing even racist white people had to respect, was the law and the order and the structure. And because it was backed by the British, it was legitimate. It had paperwork. It was by their law and court system. So when they're fighting for equality, freedom, and advancement, it's a strategy in going to that. It's controlling the minds and the numbers while showing them a black man could succeed. That is infesting. That's dangerous. Showing a successful black man doing his own thing and having his own in this land, while being able to stand next to other whites and not be a slave. Where's his movie? In 1777, he sent a request to the General Court to give slaves freedom, a right to every person. In this petition, it was January 13, 1777, Prince Hall called to the government to be held accountable for ripping many Americans out of their homelands. He challenged the government to stand with the principles that it's supposed to stand for: a natural and unalienable right to that freedom which the great parent of the universe hath bestowed equally on all mankind. So it called for the freedom of all children, as well as other slaves not free, born in a land of liberty, to receive their freedoms by the age of 21. He wanted to correct the inconsistencies in the state and feel compelled to ensure that the justice is obtained for all. They called him the father of the civil rights. Marcus Garvey, we know him. And we remember what the great Marcus Garvey was doing. So back before the Harlem Renaissance, the Return to Africa petition was going on in the 1700s, before Malcolm X, before the Black Panthers. Prince Hall was first. There was no other black thinkers like him at the time, and he came from the Barbados, and they tried to make him look like a white man. They want to abolish his name even now. They wanted to go to have most of the blacks from Massachusetts returned to Africa. Now, the House of Representatives at the time, it made it to the courts, but it fell on deaf ears. But it put everything in motion. In 1787, he sent a petition to the Senate and the House of Representatives of Massachusetts, urging that they provide the education for colored people and people of color. He wrote that blacks were taxed as whites were, and that they had not been backwards, and they had been backwards in paying their proportionary share of the total taxation. He declared that they were willing to pay their equal part, but that they were denied the privileges of education in many cases. There has been an oversight in the education of our children. Why is that? We're paying the same taxes as they are. You see, you couldn't pull that on people who know better. The same thing they do now. You try to purchase a home somewhere, you find out racism is so alive and that they don't want you in their areas. Then they come up with new rules. They come up with new fees that you're paying only because you're black. Has nothing to do with a credit score. Has nothing to do with a number. Has something to do with the color of your skin. And you never know until you walked in and smack into it. So we all hear about Frederick Douglass, right? But 100 years before Frederick Douglass, Prince Hall was demanding that slavery be abolished and emancipated and people be set free once they reach the age of 21. He was trying to find a middle ground before finding a way to abolish it completely, to free some of these people and send them back to their countries who were snatched illegally. But if you talk about famous black abolitionists, Freddie Douglass comes up first. Prince Hall is a forgotten face and went through massively greater struggles at that time than anything that we've seen in our time. A lot of the laws we have now, we wouldn't have if it wasn't for Prince Hall. So when they were kidnapping African American men in Boston at night and shipping them out and selling them out south, these slave thieves, Prince Hall called to attention concerning all of these things, and instead having them captured, and they were also exposed all of the culprits who actually were slave thieves who were stealing them and selling them as slaves in the West Indies. Prince Hall asked for the return of these men and capitalized on their status as free black men. They were free. And by bringing these attentions to the free black men taken hostage and treated with no rights, he caused many to rethink the meaning of the word freedom. So before Black Wall Street, all of these things would have never come full circle if it wasn't for Prince Hall. All you Masons that have something now came from the first Black Mason, the man who got his first house. He showed you how to do it legally, how to start. Education is always the most dangerous weapon in this world. Don't be afraid of it. I'm out.